Good evening, everyone. Kathy tells me she needs every minute that she can get, so we're going to go ahead and start. We'll do an hour tonight, and then there's 3 hours starting tomorrow morning. If you're a minister for CEUs, you need to be sure and sign up back in the back. There's also evaluations back there. My introduction is going to be very brief, but I want to make sure and acknowledge the generosity of Mutual Aid Agency. We will give them a round of applause. And Lowell for suggesting that we reach out to them. And Kim is here from Mutual Aid. And I've asked her to just come up and just say a little bit about why we think this is really important for our congregations. And that will be our introduction of Kathy, and then she will take it from there. But I just want you to be able to see Kim's face. She will not be with us tomorrow morning, but will be at her booth. And so we want everyone to stop by and just see what they have for us, and also, talk more about it if that's what is needed. So, yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to be very brief, too. Good evening. It's really great pleasure to be here, to hear Kathy and with you as we learn more about how to be healthy and safe congregations. I don't really want to take up our time talking about mutual aid, but I do want to say in the work that we do, we work hard to provide resources that will assist our church leaders in developing and implementing plans for preventing the abuse of children and other vulnerable people in our churches. So that's a big thing that we try to work with and emphasize. We also try to emphasize the importance of following those policies and plans that you put in place, so you know as church leaders how to properly respond when an allegation of abuse is reported in your church. So again, that's why we're just so excited to have Kathy with us, and we're anxious to learn about all the knowledge and resources that she has to share to equip us in managing this critical risk within our churches. So without further ado, let's welcome Kathy Reid.
To see if Chris gave me good instructions. So, I'm not a very formal person, so I decided I was going to come down on this level and whatnot and talk to you. So, I am thrilled to be here. You probably are surprised at how excited a Texan could be to come to Kansas. I mean, that's not the usual thing. We think you come down to us. But I am thrilled to be here because McPherson County is my home. I mean, this is where my family is, and I have enjoyed. I said, you don't need to get me a hotel or anything because I'm staying with my cousins in Mount Ridge, and haven't been there because of COVID for 4 years. So, like many of you, haven't traveled. So I'm glad to be there. So, some of you I know very well. Some of you I don't know at all. And so I'll be telling you a little bit about me. I do want you to ask questions. And we have a microphone, am I right? Do we have a microphone set up? We'll get it. We're going to get a microphone. It's going to be a little annual conference-y. From what I understand, it'll be setting up, and so we can have some social distance. I don't have to wear a mask because I'm going to stay away from you. But we'll have a microphone, and please do ask questions. I mean, if you go to the microphone, I'm going to recognize you, and I don't need Lowell to be my parliamentarian. So that's good, isn't it? Yeah, we got a thumbs down. So anyway, I'm thrilled to be here. I love this district. I love this district. You are awesome. I love this church and so many other churches here in Western Plains. I just think you are doing exciting work, interesting work, always bringing the best forward, trying new things, doing your best to follow Christ, and that really is a good thing. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to, again, follow Chris's instructions. Press and hold. Nope, that wasn't the press and hold button. This is the press and hold button. There it is. Okay, then I can go forward and backward. I probably overwhelmed you when you came through the door with handouts. Let me tell you why. When I was asked to do this, I was asked because I did a similar kind of presentation in Northern Plains a few years ago before COVID, and it was a day and a half, and it was a retreat. And in the process of making arrangements, I asked, what do you want me to cover? And they said, well, everything you did at Northern Plains, plus they added in a few more, which of course I can't possibly do today and tomorrow for 3 hours. So what I'm hoping is that I can say, and see that handout, and you will do that. I also want to tell you that I brought a whole bunch of books up here, which are mine, and I don't want you to take and keep forever. But even if you want to tonight, take one with you and look at it and bring it back tomorrow, please help yourself, because there's a sample of things, and I may even point out different things in my presentation that you're interested. I want to first and foremost give you permission to, let's see here if this works. It's not working. What did I do wrong, Chris? There it is. Ha-ha. I want to give you permission to take a deep breath whenever you need. If anything that we talk about triggers anything in you, please give yourself permission to leave, not come back, or take a few minutes out, or go talk to someone for a little bit and come back in. I never give a presentation in which I don't find out later that there is at least one child abuse survivor, or a domestic violence victim, or a sexual assault person, or someone who experienced rape in the room. And that means that you can find things that you hadn't expected to come back on you when we talk about something like this. Because we're going to talk a little bit about the prevalence of all those things, but particularly child abuse. So as the slide says, make your well-being your first priority, and don't hesitate to take a break. And this presentation is in your handouts. So if you missed something, you can come back. So I want to talk just a minute about language, because there's a lot of different language we can use. Some people don't want to talk about victims because they feel like that's kind of a way to put somebody down. A victim is a helpless, weak person. They'd rather talk about survivor, which is a strong person that's overcome something. You'll find me using both terms and interchangeably, and I hope that doesn't offend you, but you can do that. The other thing is abuser and perpetrator. Sometimes when we talk about situations in your own congregation, it's hard for you to think of the person who did the harm as an abuser or as a perpetrator. The law may think of them that way. It may be hard for you to think of them that way. But those are words that you need to know are going to be interchanged. I'm going to use she a lot. That doesn't mean that all women, all survivors or victims are women, or that all perpetrators are men. That's not true. But yet, the predominance of victims, both in child abuse and particularly then in rape and sexual assault, are women. Okay? So I'm not trying to leave anybody out, because everybody can experience any of these things that are coming up. Also, the other thing, you find different places talk about different things. I, for 12 years, was the executive director of the Family Abuse Center. I remember a client yelling one time, "Why am I here? I understand you abuse families here." And I thought, well, our name does kind of indicate that, doesn't it? Family abuse? Not really. People talk about domestic violence. They talk about intimate partner violence. We talked about domestic violence because we also took victims of abuse within families, meaning including children, into our services. Interpersonal violence, they're sometimes very technically different, but they are interchangeable too. And so you will hear those words in my presentations. So what do we know about violence within families? We know that these things happen. And the reason I wanted to mention domestic violence, sexual assault, and all that is because all of that happens and clusters around the same sources usually, and are often common. When I started this work in the mid-'80s, and I was an associate pastor in California, we believed that if you beat your wife, you didn't molest your children. Data proved us wrong. If you beat your wife, you are more likely to molest your children. Okay? And so every domestic violence shelter, when they do an admission when someone comes in, included in the set of questions at intake is included, does he harm your children? And that's because we're going to be talking a lot about power and control. And people who have a predilection towards abuse, sometimes it's not what they choose. The victim is not a chosen person, it's who's available. Okay, so you'll find in child abuse settings, you'll find people who molest boys because maybe they volunteer to be a Boy Scout leader and they slip through the cracks on the stuff that they're doing with background checks, and boys are available to them. But maybe if they had gotten through the cracks and become a Girl Scout leader, they'd be molesting girls, because oftentimes it's not sex specific, and sometimes it's not adult and child specific. In other words, there are offenders who will offend women or husbands, and then will offend against children too if they're available until they can fight back or until they leave their home. One of the reasons I started years ago doing these kinds of trainings on child abuse is because I think child abuse is the hardest thing to hear. If you grew up in a healthy family with loving parents, you cannot begin to understand what it's like to be in a family where the very people who are supposed to teach you trust and are supposed to encourage you and guide you, they're supposed to love you, are in fact the people who harm you the most. Can't imagine what it's like. It's totally out of our realm. If you can understand some of the dynamics of child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse, then I think in some ways elder abuse and domestic violence and sexual assault and rape are easier things to talk about. Because I think for us, particularly as Christians, the violation of a child is really about the worst thing that we can imagine. So we know that child abuse often is generational. It can happen in families. People can say that's the way I was raised, or it happened to me. I thought it was normal, so I'm doing the same thing to my children. We know that it can be taught. The first perpetrator of child abuse I ever met face-to-face was actually when I was doing CPE, and he told me that when he raped his 8-year-old daughter, he was teaching her to honor her father. Okay, so he saw himself in a teaching role. That's the way he, in his own mind, I mean, it was really one of those moments where it just stopped me in my tracks, because here he's perverting the scripture I love, the scripture that for me is holy. Some people grow up in families where abuse, whether it's physical or sexual, is so normal that they think the kids grow up thinking that's the way life is. And that's the way parents relate to children, and they don't really know that it's different. However, in all families where there's child abuse, keeping it a secret is a key element of making sure that the abuse can continue and that people can go forward with it. So the thing is that when we talk about power and control, there is in your packet a power and control wheel. When we talk about child abuse, when we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about power and control. And I always feel like I love talking to Church of the Brethren folks, I love talking to Mennonite folks about this issue, because who else, we have it sort of innately in our theology that we understand how corrupt power can be. And we understand how violence and evil things come out of that kind of controlling aspect of things. So power and control is a big part of it. When you look at that wheel, what you see is the various ways that people can be controlled and that power can be exerted over another individual. I want to talk just a minute about the statistics. The current statistics are 3.6 million children are referred to some kind of resource each year because there's some sort of allegation about child abuse in their life. that leaves us with, in this country, understanding that 343 children are abused every hour. Nearly 6 children are abused every minute in this country. 1 child is abused every 10 to 12 seconds of every hour. Almost 5 children die every day as a result of child abuse. And more than 3 out of 4 children who die of child abuse are under the age of 4. And altogether, there's 2,000 children that die annually in our country because of child abuse. And it's estimated that between 60 and 85% of child fatalities across the board are due to maltreatment, and often they're not recorded as that on their death certificates. So you can't just count up death certificates and wait for the coroner or ME to put child abuse on the list. What you're going to see is certain kinds of hemorrhaging, certain kinds of hematomas, all kinds of different medical terminology that almost kind of glosses over the fact that, that it's child abuse. Child abuse takes place in every socioeconomic level. I grew up thinking only it happened to poor kids, on the wrong side of the tracks that grew up in broken homes, maybe. I don't know. I had all those stereotypes. But it's not true. I mean, child abuse can happen in wealthy families. It happens across all socioeconomic things. It happens across every racial category. So it's not in any one race. It's not about Hispanic or African American or coming from some foreign country. If we could find a culture in the world where there is no child abuse, we could study it and figure out how that happened. And we've never been able to find that. We've never been able to find a place where child abuse does not happen. 80% of 21-year-olds that were abused as children met the criteria for at least one psychological disorder. So that means we as a culture and society have a long impact that happens because children were abused in their childhood. And they think in 2007, this is an older statistic, but I don't think because of COVID anybody's done anything since then, that the estimated cost of child abuse and neglect in the United States is about $104 billion annually. So it's costs our society, our economy, and it certainly does something with our understanding about how children should be raised and giving them the ability to flourish and be who they should be. So what I want to talk about here in this first part is an introduction and framework, and I am going to ask you some questions and have you raise them because there are going to be some details that I'm going to skip over if you already know it, okay? So that we can move along more quickly. So, Jesus called for the children and he said, "Let the little children come to me and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs." The scripture is very clear about the special nature about children and how we need to care for them and protect them. I can give you more scriptures that you can look at, but I think in particular Luke 18, 16 to 17 is important for us to remember. "Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." I mean, we're reminded throughout the scripture that Jesus and the disciples understood the importance of children. Now, you should have a handout that says ethical framework. And you'll see that on the screen it says, why we do what we must. And I'd love to have somebody, if you can read it, because I know it's kind of far and hard at times. Why we do what we must. What's the first thing? Somebody volunteer to read it.
Because of the power differential.
Okay, I mean, somebody's got more power than someone else. Why else do we do it? What's the next one?
When we have power and authority.
Yep. Go on, someone else. Mm-hmm. The church is a community of faith. Someone else.
Gospel mandate.
Mm-hmm. We have a gospel mandate. Great. Next one. Yeah. How do you react to those? What do you think about them? Yeah. Isn't it? It's kind of sad that we even have to read it. Yeah. Yeah. And yet some people would think that abuse doesn't have anything to do with church, doesn't have anything to do with our faith, right? So I'm going to be talking a little bit about trauma-informed care. It's kind of a buzzword in a lot of counseling things right now, trauma-informed care. My daughter is a therapist, and she specializes in trauma-informed care, and she specializes in trauma, and so she's always talking about the long-term impact that happens on childhood from children being abused. So, one of the things I find really interesting is we do owe a debt of gratitude to the military. It's kind of strange for me as a good pacifist, Mennonite Church of the Brethren person to say, but it's really true. The military in the last 20 years has done a wonderful job of studying PTSD. And we could never, in the domestic violence community, never get the financial backing to really do that for society as a whole, to look at what is PTSD and how does it happen and who does it happen to and how can you overcome it. But the military was forced, probably not volunteered for, but they were forced to really do that. And that's really helpful for us when we talk about child abuse, because one of the impacts of abuse in small children is that they exhibit signs after that and even into adulthood of PTSD, which I think in the past was something that we didn't even know what to call it. We didn't know what to call it when it happened in military settings, but we didn't know how to call it. And trauma, understanding trauma really helps us as care providers. And Leslie and I were talking about even some follow-up things. One of the things that would be really good, and I'm not the person to do this because there are trained people who really understand trauma, but one of the things that I really advocate for not only pastors but lay leaders and whole congregations is for them to have some training on what is trauma and how you respond to trauma. Because trauma is so pervasive in our culture that when we're responding to people in almost any pastoral care setting, I need to tell you that, somebody's asked me before, they said, when did you get started talking and working on this issue? Back in the 80s, I went to seminary and graduated, got ordained in the Church of the Brethren, and was an associate pastor at a United Methodist church. Sorry to be unfaithful to the Brethren, but that's who gave me a job, and I needed a job, and I was there. And one weekend, my husband said to me, he said, there's really good training come up, you ought to go to it. And there are a few of you that know Steve Reid, and he's pretty darn smart. And so I listened when he says you ought to think about it, and I did, and I signed up, and I went. And I went to the whole training on child abuse. I heard those statistics particularly about child abuse. The one that I didn't mention, which you may know, because sadly it has not changed since the 80s, is 1 in 4 girls in the United States will be molested before she's 18 years old. And 1 in 7 boys will be molested before they're 18 years old in this country. And clinicians who work with these children will tell you that the difference between the 1 in 4 and the 1 in 7 is probably reporting, because in our culture it's very difficult for boys and men to admit that they have been sexually assaulted, right? So, I heard all these statistics, some of them that I read off, some that I didn't read off, but I heard these statistics about children, and it's a little bit like when you're a youth and you go to camp and you come back and you really can't tell your parents about what mountaintop experience that was, and it just doesn't come out in words. And I came back and I had a hard time talking to people about the weekend training that I did, but I went to this congregation where I was the associate pastor. Children were my specialty, called the kids up to church. And this congregation was one of the 150 fastest growing United Methodist churches at the time. And when I called the kids up, I had between 75 and 100 children come forward. And those kids came up, and I'm ready to launch into my little children's story that I've worked on or gotten out of a book or something, came up with somewhere. And I was speechless because all I could do was count their heads. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I thought to myself, I don't know a single kid. I think I know their parents really well. I was there like 9 years. I thought I knew their parents really well. I thought I knew them. There was one family that had adopted through foster care some kids who I knew had some issues, but we didn't talk about what they were. But I didn't know any other kid that had been hurt that way. So either my little United Methodist Church of 500 members or whatever is an exception to the rule, or I'm awfully naive about what's going on in that congregation, right? I'm awfully naive. And I will tell you that that is my experience, because what I decided to do after that weekend is I decided that issues of child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, rape were things I was going to talk about as a pastor. I was going to include it in my prayers to the people. I was going to use examples of domestic violence in my sermons. I was going to talk about it. And people came to me and said, nobody in their lifetime of hearing sermons, no one ever talked about someone's experience of rape or someone's experience of being brutalized by a family member. People didn't talk about it. And when I started to do that, I opened the floodgates. And I had parents who came to talk to me about what their children had experienced, some of them with coaches, some of them with band instructors, some of them from Boy Scout leaders. I had a woman come to me and talk to me about her son, who she didn't tell anyone was in prison for molesting someone, which, bless her heart, she didn't get any support because she kept it a secret. I had an 82-year-old woman come to me and tell me that she never in her whole life, not even her husband, did she tell about what the doctor in a little tiny town in Iowa did to her on her 12th birthday. And she knew he did it to every 12-year-old girl in that town for decades. I mean, it should bring you flashes of some of the stuff that happened with our gymnastics teams, where they were brutalized repeatedly and told that that's the way it happens. Now, she didn't want counseling. She didn't want therapy. She didn't even want pastoral care. She just wanted to tell me, and I listened, and I told her if she wants to talk about it, I'd be glad to talk about it. That's all she needed. That's fine with me. I was there if she did need more. But all of a sudden, I started being barraged by these issues, and especially child abuse issues in the congregation when I thought there were none. So I guess at the end of tomorrow, what I'm hoping, if you don't get anything else out of this presentation, I think one of the things I want you to do is take your blinders off. Just take your blinders off, because this happens in good families, in Christian families, in people who share the pew with you, people you work with, people down the street. It is pervasive in our culture, unfortunately, and that doesn't mean you should be just willy-nilly accusing people, but it means you need to have your eyes open and know that not only is it happening to children right there, but more importantly, you have adult survivors in your congregation. And I think, this is just my own personal observation, and I don't think it's supported by any research, but it's my observation and I'm going to claim it, and that is, I think churches are filled with survivors, because when you are molested as a child, it leaves you with huge questions. Why didn't God protect me? Why didn't my parents love me? How can I be accepted? How do I find belonging? Huge questions. And where do you go to answer those questions? Church, right? Church, that's where you sit in the pew and you listen to somebody, and they're going to hopefully answer some of those questions. That's where you hope you find belonging and acceptance and caring. And so my guess is that if you go to your own congregation, whether you're a pastor or a layperson or anybody else, and if you had heard the stories, what you would find is there's probably more than 1 in 4 people in your congregation who experienced some kind of abuse in their life before they got to you. if you would just listen and if you would care enough to enter that possibility. So if you're naive enough to think it doesn't happen in my little Church of the Brethren, it's probably not true. It probably is there somewhere. There's a huge impact on child abuse. So I'm going to run through, how many of you know what child abuse is? Not as many of you as I had hoped, but you have stuff in your packet, handouts that will tell you, but here's what I want to tell you is, let's see, first of all, I'm getting a little befuddled here, and Dave Sollenberger at annual conference gave me permission to be befuddled when I'm presenting. Gave all of us permission to be befuddled at time. Okay, so here's the, I have up on the screen here the actual definition. It's found at the childwelfare.gov site about what is child abuse. Any recent act of or failure to act on the past of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act of failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. Okay? We generally divide things into 4 categories. You can see them up there. Physical abuse, that's the easiest one, I think, for people to understand, and we know about it. It's the abuse when a person deliberately or intentionally causes harm or injury to a child. So anything that leaves bruises behind is considered physical child abuse. You will meet people who say, when I was a kid, they beat me with a switch or whatever, and my legs turned black, but it helped me be a better person. And that may be true. Or maybe you meet somebody who comes from another culture where that's the way they discipline people and that's the way they were raised. Well, that may be true, but in this country, it's all illegal. And it may have been true 20 years ago, 30 years, 50 years ago. It's illegal now. You cannot physically or deliberately harm, intentionally cause bodily harm. Emotional abuse is probably the most devastating thing that can happen to any person. I will tell you, when I was doing domestic violence work, that women would tell me, my bones heal, but I don't know if my soul ever will. Okay? Because emotional abuse is what takes your confidence away and takes away your options, your choices, makes you feel lower than low, makes you submit to things you wouldn't normally, doesn't allow you to stand up for yourself. There's just so many consequences on children and adults who experience emotional abuse. Neglect, of course, is the biggest category, actually, of documented child abuse. And we have so much of that, with kids who are not supervised or kids who are left alone. And you've probably heard horror stories about mom who works at some Walmart or something and she locks her kids in the trunk while she goes to work because she doesn't have daycare. Or parents who don't feed their children, or parents who don't take their kids to the doctor. All of that falls into that neglect, anything that endangers a child's health, safety, or welfare. And finally, sexual abuse. And I think it's important to know that sexual abuse refers to an act committed by a parent, caregiver, or a person in position of trust, which is not accidental. Okay? It's important to know it's not accidental, and which may harm the child's physical, mental health, or the child's welfare. It involves sexual contact between a child or a teenager and an adult or a significantly older, more powerful person. And it includes inappropriate verbal stimulation of a child or teenager, taking or showing sexually explicit photographs, showing children pornography to a child or a teenager, or asking a child or a teenager to look at pornography or to watch a sex act. I've actually met perpetrators who will say, I didn't touch them. Well, then you say, did you ask the child to touch you? Well, yeah, but the child did that. So they don't think of that as sexual abuse. But it's any act that does that, and it can be non-touching. So looking at pornography is definitely one of these things. So you have a handout that has warning signs of abuse, of those 4 kinds of abuse. So you can look at that and see. If you glance at it, I think I know what you'll notice. Tell me, though. If you glance at it, what do you notice? It's a long list. Is it very specific? It is in some ways very specific. But what you'll see is that it is a long list of warning signs that can be for any child who has experienced deep trauma. Okay? So if you're in a school setting and you see a child behaving in one of the ways that you see on that paper and you go, oh, that's a sign of, it may not be. For example, a child who goes through a traumatic divorce experience with their parents may exhibit some of the same symptoms and signs as a child who's been abused, okay? Because it's trauma, and that's the big thing we are always talking about is trauma. So some of those signs can come out. So it's important, I think, for me to say, I don't want you to be naive about child abuse, but I also don't want you to leave here this weekend and start thinking you're the abuse police and you're going to look under every rock for abuse. I just want you to be open to the fact that it could be abuse and use your skills that you have as an adult to watch that situation. And we're going to talk about reporting and what you have to do if you really suspect it is child abuse. Okay? Any questions about that? So, what am I doing now? Yes, I'm befuddled again. I think I missed a page here. It's important to remember, this is the quote that I wanted to put in front of you. A child is never truly capable of consenting to or resisting such contact and or such sexual acts. Often the child is physically, psychologically dependent upon the perpetrator of the abuse. This can be touching and non-touching. And you will hear over and over again offenders say, she came on to me. Okay? She may have, in the literal sense that she came on, but if she did, it's probably a sign that somebody's done something to her before that even. That's actually on the warning signals. But if she or he is a child, they cannot give consent. They legally cannot give consent. And if the perpetrator is older than, usually the rule of thumb is 3, 4 years, 5 years, then it's the same as if it's an adult. So if it's a 12-year-old who's molesting a 4-year-old, it legally becomes the same as if it's an adult, and that child cannot give consent. I learned a long time ago that a lot of perpetrators sexually abuse children under the age of 3. Do you know why? Because you can't certify a child under 3 to be a witness very often. I mean, I imagine there are, you're an attorney. Do you know anything about that? I understand that it's very difficult to certify a small child who's basically nonverbal as a witness. So that child may tell their parents in language that the parent understands that the perpetrator did such and such to them, but to be able to tell it in court in a way that you're going to get a conviction is very difficult. So if perpetrators sexually abuse children under 3, they have a better chance of getting off in court. And they know that. How sick is that? No, that tells us something. So what are the results of child abuse? Well, it's pretty simple. Lack of trust and relationship difficulties. So if you can't trust your parents, who can you trust in life? You're going to be able to trust your husband? You're going to be able to trust your neighbor? Probably not. Abuse by a primary caregiver damages the most fundamental relationship as a child. The child will not feel safe, cannot rely on their parent for physical or emotional needs because the person who's responsible for their care is not providing it and instead is harming them. And that results in core feelings of worthlessness or damaged goods. So I think one of the things you'd find is, for example, if you did a survey of prostitutes, you'd find that almost to 100% they were abused as children because they have no self-esteem. They are doing what they have to do or think they have to do to survive, and basically have been brought up to be overly sexualized sometimes by the abuse that they experienced as children. It's not true for everybody, but it is true for a large number of victims. children who are abused have a very tough time regulating their emotions. So extreme tantrums, pounding their fists, screaming and yelling, flying off the handle, anger management issues. It turns into anger management issues as adults, but even before then. So trouble regulating their emotions is an important impact that you will see in child abuse. And then childhood trauma also affects brain development. And for me, that's the most exciting, biggest change that I have experienced in working in this area since the mid-'80s, is that we now are so good at being able to do brain scans. And what a great thing we're doing. I mean, if any of you have had either a concussion or had something that happened to your head, you know that they can go in and slice and dice and look at everything that's there and make sure things are lighting up and whatnot. It's very interesting to now be able to compare the brains of children who have been abused with children who have not. And they can see in their brains damage that's done at a very early age. I want to give you an example that's not child abuse, but it's domestic violence related. I heard a lot of people who would tell me that if the child wasn't in the room when the domestic violence happened, if the child didn't witness mom or dad beating each other, they were unaffected. You know what they did? They studied the brains of 6-month-old babies from healthy homes and from homes where there was domestic violence. It didn't matter whether the domestic violence took place in front of the child or not. Children are like sponges, and they sense the tension and the stress, and they understand things that even at 6 months they, of course, can't verbalize, but they know what's going on, even though they're not necessarily right there. And when they scanned their brains, there was a huge difference at 6 months between healthy children coming from healthy homes and children in domestic violence homes. At 6 months is right when children, babies, start figuring out that if you smile at them, they'll smile back. And if they smile, you'll smile. I mean, they start to understand that it's a kind of reciprocal thing, and that's why we all go goo goo gaga to them and make ourselves silly, because we're trying to get a response from them. Children in domestic violence homes can't do that at 6 months, because that part of their brain has been basically, I would say sort of incapacitated. They use all their brain power just to keep themselves alive. So their brains light up on their core functions in terms of eating, sleeping, and the basic necessities of life, rather than on the outer peripheral parts that are more about learning and interacting and being relationship things. So can you imagine what we're doing to so many children, at such an early age? Imagine what beating a child does, even at a young age. It has a huge impact on it. Now, what we've been doing in this field for the last 20 years is we've been talking about ACEs. Anybody know what ACEs is? Raise your hand. Oh, yeah, a bunch of you. Yeah. So the wonderful thing about ACEs, if you haven't studied anything about it, ACEs is a wonderful thing. They determine that there are basically critical experiences that can happen to a person. And the more of those experiences you have, basically it gives you a number, the more likely it is that you have experienced extreme trauma. And so you have there in the handout some things, but I think Leslie had some extra things that we're putting over there. Where did we put them?
Well, I haven't put them anywhere yet.
You don't have to do it now. Do it later. But I have some extra beautifully colored ACEs charts. So I would, those of you who are interested, I'd suggest you get it, because it tells us a little bit about how children exposed to these sustained periods of physical or emotional danger, how they can wind up affecting their adult life. And the thing that's interesting is on the ACEs, when you get your score, it correlates very well with your life expectancy, which is kind of scary. The more critical experiences you have as a child or in your early adult, the more likely it is that you will have a shorter lifespan. Isn't that something? So that tells us a little bit about what we're doing. So I have this blob for you. I love these blobs. They are a big deal for me, and I don't know what to call them, but I hope that there is one in your packet because it's hard to see on the screen. But this little blob shows you some of the impact on child abuse that there is for children who have been abused. So, there's things like high-risk behavior when they're teenagers, drugs, depression, running away from home is a common impact of child abuse, prostitution or trafficking, truancy from school, criminal activity, economic consequences, educational disparities. These are kids that drop out of school often for no reason at all. Cognitive delays, so they can be behind in school. Sexual risk-taking. Teen pregnancies go way up among, in Waco, I was working with some community people to talk about, they were real interested in reducing teen pregnancy. And so they wanted to spend money on contraception and all kinds of stuff. It was good stuff. I mean, they were really looking at teen pregnancy. And I raised my hand and I said, well, are you going to do something about coercive sex? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, the statistic I've always heard is that 60% of teen pregnancies are the result of rape or sexual coercion. We treat most pregnant teenagers as though they just did something wrong and that they're to blame for the situation they're in, rather than us understanding that many of them did not choose to be in the situation that they're in at all, but rather they are a victim who's winding up being pregnant now, okay? So if you're trying to reduce teen pregnancy, you need to go into the schools and talk to kids in junior high even about sexual abuse, so that they know that if somebody's abusing them, they need to tell somebody. They need to get some help. They need to be trained to be able to tell their peers no, and have the strength and the resiliency to be able to say, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to be put in that situation. The peer pressure on young girls is just incredible for them to have unprotected sex, which in this day and age, I think most of us can't even fathom. But it is in epidemic proportions in our high schools and in our junior highs. And that's part of the reason why we wind up with having high teen pregnancy rates. So this little chart just gives you some examples of what the impact is. I love the next one, which you should also have, which is building resiliency. What I want to tell you about building resiliency is that's the good news. If I've bummed you out and depressed you about the situation for children in this world, do not despair. Because the amazing thing about kids is they are resilient. And with the right kind of help, and with the right kind of family environment, and the right kind of support, they can heal from all of this stuff that we're talking about. It's not necessarily easy, but they can do it. And that's why I love training churches in trauma and in child abuse, because you know what I think is good prevention for child abuse? A great Sunday school program. Really. I don't know about you, but I remember second grade when I sat on my teacher's lap in Sundays after Sunday school, and I cried and told her something that I thought I could not talk to my parents about. I really didn't think I could talk to my parents. And yet, she was a trusted individual. It wasn't child abuse in my case. It was something else, and I don't even remember what it was. But part of our job in churches, in Sunday school, and in our family activities, and in the way we reach out to children needs to be building resiliency. You cannot protect every child from abuse. You can't do it. I mean, I'm going to talk about programs you can have in your church and how you have people sign contracts and what to do about predators who come to your church and all that. But you can do all of that, and you're not going to be able to keep every predator out. Okay? Perpetrators are awfully smart. And when they started screening people for abuse in the Boy Scouts, what did perpetrators do? They found somebody who's not screening. Who might that be? Now, I pastored a little tiny church, a little tiny Mennonite church. Boy, somebody walks through the door on Sunday morning and you greet them and you say, hi, we're so glad you're here. And they say, oh, I'm really into teenagers. And you say, great. We need a Sunday school teacher. Matter of fact, the kids are going this weekend on a camping trip. Here's the keys to the church van. Go take them. Because we're just thrilled to have somebody who's interested. Well, how do I know that person, who maybe has a good Mennonite name, or good Church of the Brethren name, how do I know that person is volunteering for the right reasons, right? And where are perpetrators going to find access to kids? It's going to be the churches that don't do, we're going to talk about what to do, but the churches that don't do background checks on their teachers, the churches that don't talk about sexual abuse, the places where they can come in and volunteer and nobody asks questions. I mean, they find a way to get access to children, and if it's going to be, a community church, say, for example, rather than maybe a church that's in a strong denomination where things get reported. They just move to a new venue and a new place. And that's why it's so important that we as churches are strong about the signals we send out about how we care about children and the steps we're willing to do to protect children. Because that guy who just came in and took the keys to the van because I'm so desperate for a youth leader is less likely to stay in my church if I say, we're thrilled to have somebody who's interested in kids. But before you do that, why don't you spend some time getting to know the congregation first? And then if you're still serious about teaching our kids, I will be glad to talk to you about the requirements, and we're going to do a background check, and we're going to do, and I tell him what we're going to do. I mean, if he's a perpetrator, he's probably going to say, I think I'll find another church where they give me the keys to the van, right? So building resiliency, I think a good church school program, that's one of the reasons why when I was in Elgin, I just loved our curriculum that we do for kids, because resiliency is built into it, where you're teaching kids how to be more confident, to understand Jesus loves them, that they can trust the loving people around them, like that the church is just more people to care for them, that it's a family that they can really reach out to and they can trust. All of the things we do in a good children's program, everything we do in a good family program helps build resiliency. So don't think that you have to sit intensely and talk to small children about sexual abuse, and that's going to be hard because you're embarrassed and they're embarrassed. It's not all that. Some of it is just really emphasizing the children's program. For 12 years, I was pastor of Austin Mennonite Church. For 12 years, I taught Sunday school, children's Sunday school. I didn't know too many senior pastors that did that. And why did I do it? Because I really believed in our children's program, and I really wanted the children to have the best possible thing. And we were a small congregation. It was hard to recruit teachers, and so I had to recruit myself, and that was okay. It was really okay. My gift to my Sunday school teachers was that I taught all the kids all summer myself in group. And, quite frankly, I was writing curriculum for Brethren Press during that time, and one of the things that was great about it is I tried out stuff on them. They were my little guinea pigs for experimenting with curriculum that I was writing to see if it would work. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, that was great. Oh, I need to add something else. I mean, it was a great experience for me because I cared so much about those kids. Not everybody's in a circumstance where they can do that, and may not be your gift or anybody you know's gift, but to really emphasize children. When I talk to people about how they lose families in their church, so many times it's because they don't have a program for my kids. Or there's too few kids in the youth group, and so we're going to a big Baptist church down the street where they've got a lot of kids, and they show movies, and it's show and tell all the time, and they have good perks, and good food every time. I mean, somehow we have to have depth to I don't think we have to do all that stuff. I think we have to have the corner on the market of caring about our kids and letting them know how much we care about them and how they can build relationships with people of all generations in our congregations. Because if you go to our churches, you're going to wind up with an unofficial set of grandparents, right? You're going to have those kinds of relationships, and that's what builds resiliency, those kinds of things. How are we doing on time, Leslie?
7:24.
Which means 5 more minutes. And one of my problems is that, we could, if she said, Kathy, just keep on going, you might leave about 2 because I could natter on forever. But we're at a good place to take questions. So, Sonia, you got something for me?
Yeah, I have a question for you, and maybe you said something that I didn't hear,
Yeah.
but I wish you'd talk about the whole concept of spanking.
Of spanking?
When, if ever, is it appropriate? How is it done? And is it ever done in ways, which I know it is,
Well,
that are not appropriate?
Yeah, I did not talk about that, and that's a great question, Sonia, because that's the one I hear all the time. To make a long story short, my husband got this cockamamie idea he was going to teach at Baylor University at Truett Seminary, and so I was really screwed over because I had to find a job, and those Baptists were not going to hire a woman pastor. And so I had to really look for something else, and so that's when I kind of jumped the fence from working in churches about these issues to being a direct service provider. So in our domestic violence shelter, we had a rule, no spanking, and we were just upfront about it. And I told literally hundreds of women who had a very hard time with that rule often, that you're here because someone beat you, and while you are here, you are not going to beat anyone. Okay, so no spanking. And what our children's service provider that really worked with the parents, what she really tried to do, which I just loved, was to help parents understand that there are alternatives to spanking. Spanking is not inappropriate and is not wrong. If you don't use any bruising, I mean, if you use bruising and you use anything other than an open hand, you are crossing the line into abuse. And it is also abuse if you're doing it out of anger. Okay, so you're calm, you use spanking as a consequence. I don't know about you, but that's the kind of home I went into. But I will tell you that my dad could spank me if he wanted to, and it never hurt as much as when he said, Kathy, I'm disappointed in you.
Exactly.
When he said, Kathy, I'm disappointed in you, you could have just scraped me off the floor. I mean, that was the worst thing that could happen to me. And with my kids, I find I decided early on not to spank them, and I didn't spank my children. And I learned that taking away their Nintendo was highly more effective. And, that there were other things you can do for discipline. And so, it's kind of hard to argue with a parent who really, really believes spanking is the only alternative they have. And I don't think it helps necessarily to tell, wag your finger and say it's wrong. I don't think it's the best approach, and I personally think it's okay if it's done properly and in the right way. But what I really want parents to do is to really expand the ways that they discipline their children so that they have more tools. And what I found in the shelter is that I had mother after mother who thought beating the crap out of your kid was the only way to get them to behave. And so their kids none of these kids knew about time out, or now we do time in rather than isolating kids. We want them in, but you hug them and you bring them in. You do time in instead, but they didn't think about taking anything away, privileges away from their child. They didn't think about having a conversation. I just had grandson for a week, and I discovered I had epic grandmother fail. He was there visiting for 6 days, and it wasn't until it was over that I understood that he did not have 7 Steph Curry jerseys. He had worn the same shirt for the entire week he was with me. And so that merited having a little conversation with him in which I said, I'm your grandparent, and if you're old enough to fly across the country and come visit me for a week, you are old enough to change your clothes every morning, and I'm disappointed in you. And he started to cry. But that conversation, I think, was far more effective than if I had probably done anything else. You have a comment? Okay, you're going to have to speak up because I hate to admit it, but I'm getting old and I'm experiencing some hearing loss. Sure. And so I heard bits and pieces of that.
Okay, so you were saying that spanking can be used as an effective tool. I'm curious to know, what is the rationale for when it would be effective and why would it be effective?
I think it's a little bit, let me say, I'm not sure that I think it's appropriate but I think it's hard to argue with parents who think it's appropriate. I think if a parent thinks it's appropriate, you can reason with them and tell them, to me, spanking is inappropriate. And I taught public school in the state of Georgia for 7 years, in which the principal had a paddle that big, and he had it in the principal's office, and he used it. It was actually the one factor that made me a better teacher, because I decided I would never send a child to the principal's office because I never wanted any of my students to be paddled, which meant I had to get control of my classroom, and I had to have consequences within the classroom so that I never got to the situation where I had to call the principal or send somebody up there. And, you know, I would be blatant and tell people that spanking is wrong and shouldn't be done. I think for us as pacifists, as people of peace, we should not be spanking our children. But I think that in any church, you're going to find some people who are going to argue that that's the way they were raised and it was good for them. And I think you can educate people and you can have discussions about it. But if they're sure that for them it's the best way to discipline their children, I think the next best solution is to at least get them to expand to other options of discipline. Does that make more sense? I think maybe I'm being more clear. Yeah.
And how about helping parents understand that most of the time when they spank, it's because they are angry.
I think it comes out of anger so much. I mean, I think
does
you know,
too.
if you abide by those rules, that it's always open-handed and it's always on their bottom and it doesn't leave marks, and you're not in anger, there aren't very many situations that many parents can use spanking, because that eliminates most of the times when most parents would use it, because they are angry.
And so what the child learns is, if you are angry and if you're bigger than I am, I can hit you.
Yep. Yeah. And they don't see it any different than the abuse that somebody else might be experiencing. Next up. Yes.
And I'm also, maybe I need to go to that. There we go. I'm going to notice the time. I'm also going to I need to take a very deep breath.
Yes.
Because this is heavy stuff. Some of us, it might be new. Some of us, it evokes memories of, oh my gosh. And so just to hold that for a moment and, absorb that somewhat.
Do you want to ask one last question? And then,
what I'm going to suggest is, Kathy's here, and we'll keep talking. If people
need to leave, either because you're overwhelmed or it's just too late, please
also
exchange yourself.
I'm going to sit back there. If you just want to talk this through or something, that's fine too.
And I'm not running off, so I'd love to talk to anybody who wants to talk.
Go and ask your question. I'm going to sit back there. And yes, Kathy brought a whole bunch of handouts. I put the trauma one on the table. I have some others that I'll have on the table tomorrow that my understanding is they're leftovers from other things. And so just
And if you want to browse these books up here, I trust you all that you will return them tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay?
And so let us offer our
Maybe I
thanks to
shouldn't.
Kathy. Obviously, rich and deep knowledge and
Thank
wisdom
you.
for us.
Thank you. I'm here to answer your question. So you want to give me one?
I want to make an announcement of support of Brethren Press and Mental Media and the Shine curriculum.
Isn't it wonderful?
When you were talking about resiliency here, from all the stuff that we did with the summer Bible school program, that program is full of building resiliency in children. So.
And I have to say, we need to be sophisticated about looking at Sunday school curriculum, because sometimes we just think it all looks the same, or we go for the glossiest, has the most stuff that just attracts kids, and we need to look at the underlying things that it's really trying to teach children. And I think the Shine curriculum is just amazing. So, yeah. Okay, so we're at a good breaking point. Tomorrow we're going to talk about who are abusers. We're going to talk about the way you handle situations in congregations, what you do if a child comes to you and tells you they're being abused, what to do if, I think it's the Mountain View Church out west that had the offender halfway house 2.5 blocks from the church, and the head of the offender program said our guys want to come to church, and they had to grapple with, what are you going to do when you have 2 pews full of people who are sex offenders coming to church? Do you tell them they can't? Do you tell them they can? What do you do? Because wouldn't that freak out parents? You know, I mean, so we're going to talk about all that tomorrow. So be thinking of questions because I really want to answer your questions. And Leslie and I have talked about follow-up things in the future where we can go into more depth into certain details. And I'm not always the person to do that, but, you know, be telling Leslie too about what you're interested in, what your questions are. And I'm here if you want to talk to me, but I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And in the meantime, I'm going to go home and sleep in the bedroom of my dad where he grew up. How's that? So, yeah. Thank you all for being here.